Right, this particular module is going to focus on incentive compensation. And so compensation has a kind of a guaranteed component, which is called the base. It also has a variable component, which is called incentive compensation. So that will be the focus for this particular module. So when you think about the incentive pay categories, there's three. So you can incentivize at the level of the individual, you can incentivize at the level of the group or organization-wide. So it can be one of those, two of those, or all three of those. So let's take a look at some performance measures that are typically tied to those three categories. So with regard to the individual incentive plans, they can be tied to quantity of work. So think about sales. They can be tied to the quality of the work. They can also be timed based upon length of time. So is it a quarterly incentive? Is it a monthly incentive? You wouldn't necessarily do a daily incentive. They can also be tied with regard to work safety records and work attendance as well. So now let's look at group performance metrics. So for group incentive plans, it goes beyond the individual. So that could be labor cost savings, it could be material cost savings, it could be reductions in accidents, as well as service cost savings. So that happens at the level of the group. It could also be customer satisfaction as well. And the third category, besides the individual, the group, is company-wide or organization-wide. That's typically tied to profits. It could also be tied to cost containment, market share if you're publicly traded, and if you're a sales-driven organization, then sales revenue. So one of the key decisions that must be made is A, will you incentivize, yes or no, and then B, at what level? Individual, group, and or organization. So regardless of whether you say individual, group, and or organization, then you have to select your performance metrics. So this particular slide is just an overview, and if you'll note, it talks about the individual, the group, and the organization. So now let's go a little bit more detail into incentive pay design, because these are designed by compensation and benefit professionals. So you want to begin with what's called the end in mind. And some of you that may have read 7 Habits of Highly Effective People know that that quote comes from Stephen Covey. So what that means is, what are you trying to accomplish? So if you have a compensation philosophy, then what you would do is from that you would derive the design intent of your incentive plan. So these are some questions that you want to ask when you're sitting down and designing or redesigning an incentive compensation plan. First one, is it going to be based on individual, group performance, or maybe company-wide performance? What's the acceptable level of risk? Because if you think about it, if you are incentivized as an individual and say I'm going to pay you 80% of base, that's guaranteed, so you'll get that regardless, but your variable comp is going to be 20%. So let's say your base is $100,000 and your variable could be $20,000, could be. So the base, there's no could be, it is. So your total compensation could be as high as $120,000. You're going to get the base of $100,000 guaranteed. The potential upside is $20,000, so 100 plus 20 equals $120,000. Contingent upon you performing at certain specified, known, in advance targets. That's a good thing, get $120,000. However, let's say you don't hit the targets, or you only hit 50% of the targets. So if you hit 50% of the targets and the variable is $20,000, then you're going to get a quote-unquote haircut, if you will, to $10,000. So you still get your base, guaranteed, $100,000. You hit 50% of the targets, so 20 times 0.5 is 10. So that winds up to $110,000, hence acceptable level of risk. And then also you have to think about is, does the incentive compensation or variable compensation replace traditional pay? So some of you may actually be 100% what I call eat what you kill comp models or sales plans. So it's not uncommon for sales folks, whether they're in the manufacturing industry, whether they're registered reps, or whether they're in the financial consulting business, to be 100% incentivized compensation. So if you hit your targets, then a lot of upside. If you don't hit any of your targets, nothing, or something in between. And the other design question is, what's the performance criteria by which you will evaluate individual, group, and or company? And lastly, what's the appropriate time horizon? So you're going to look at performance over a week. Is it going to be over a month? Is it going to be quarterly? Is it going to be biannually or annually? So from a behavioral point of view and from a motivational point of view, you want to make it more frequent, not less frequent. So in general, monthly is better than annually, but daily it's more frequent, but it doesn't give people time to actually make adjustments. So those are some of the questions that you must sit down and answer when you're looking at incentive pay design. So now let's look at the funding of it, because the money has to come from at least two sources. So these are two sources where the money comes from to fund the variable. So first, it can actually come from increased profits or from cost savings that accrue because of higher performance. So that's called a self-funded plan. Ideally, that's the best plan. So the incentive compensation pays for itself. Because if you think about base compensation, that's a fixed cost. Incentive compensation or variable compensation is what type of cost? Hopefully you said variable, which means it's also a risk to the organization. The alternative way to fund these are you just put it a line item on the budget, but then you'd have to model. So let's say you have 1,000 employees and you estimate that 20% will hit all the targets. And if they hit all the targets, then each person will get $10,000. So then if you add that all up, then what you get is $200,000 for that 20%. But you're never really sure what that distribution will look like, because it could be is that in 1 year, 50% hit that target, but you've only budgeted for 20%, so you're down by 30. It could be another year is you budget for 20, but 10% hit it, so you get a 10% saving. So in general, when you look at this funding decision, you want to self-fund because it reduces the risk for the organization's perspective. So let's look at some risks to incentive or variable compensation. Risk number one is this. Is it truly aligned with performance at the individual, group, or company-wide basis? It should be to mitigate that risk. Risk number two. So when you're evaluating performance, managers make rating errors. So in the rating errors, they're not actually measuring the performance, but there's a lot of noise. So a common one is a contrast error. High performers, low performers. So what happens is you rate the higher performers higher and you rate the lower performers lower because your basis of comparison is relative rather than against the absolute standard. Some other errors are called distributional errors. One is the leniency effect. So let's say that your performance rating goes from 1 to 5. So 1 is you're about to get fired, 3 is you're doing a great job, average 5, wow, you're really blowing it out the park. So for those managers that have a leniency error, and let's say they have 10 employees, maybe 9 out of 10 will have a 5. Flip it over. For those managers that have a strictness error, and let's imagine they have 10 employees, then maybe 9 out of the 10 get 1s. And for those that have a central tendency error, again with those 10 employees, is 9 out of 10 get a 3. So these are errors that are common to managers. So for those of you that evaluate the performance of others, are you, as the manager, the evaluator, are you subject to the contrast error? Or are you subject to any of these distributional errors? I tend to be subject to the leniency error. Another risk, again, related to risk number 2, are the halo error as well as the horn effect as well. Now I'll let you take a look at those. Those are just some other examples. So risk number 3, lack of funding. And this cartoon kind of describes that in a humorous way, but we talked about that in terms of ways to mitigate the risk of funding. Risk number 4, I'd call it playing games. So playing games is you like a certain person, so since you like them, they're going to get a 5. So what you do is you play with all the stuff such that they get a 5. You can work the other way. You hate one employee's guts, just hate them, just don't like them, never liked them. Yep, you didn't hire them, but so what do? Is you do things such that they can never get anything other than a 1 or a 2. So that's kind of the politics playing game side of the equation. So hopefully what you have learned about is, what is incentive compensation? How do you design incentive compensation? What are the categories of incentive compensation, as well as the risks? So let's pause for a moment and do a self-assessment. So I'm going to have some items, and you tell me whether it's true or whether it's false. Number 1, market share is an example of a group or team-based incentive. So is it true or is it false? Hopefully you said false. So market share is company-wide, organization-wide. Number 2, a manager rates all 10 employees at the midpoint. This is an example of a leniency error. True or false? Hopefully you said false. That's central tendency, midpoint. Incentive compensation is based upon the quality of the performance review system. True or false? It's true. Because remember, one of the risks is that the performance evaluation system might be flawed in some way. Next one, it's essential to fund the payouts of any incentive plan. Obviously true. And the last one, as a manager, your first employee that you evaluate is in the top 1% of all employees that you've ever seen and experienced. And the second employee that you evaluate is in the middle of the pack, but seems to be a poorer performer after evaluating the top performer. This is an example of the contrast effect. True or false? Hopefully you said true, because indeed it is. You're making a relative rather than an absolute comparison. So hopefully you feel very good about having a competency with regard to what an incentive plan is, how to design one, how to redesign one, and the power of such a plan. Thank you.